Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. I'm glad to see you made it back for another episode. Today we're going to be going on a camping trip, my friends, so I hope you brought enough supplies. These viewers sent in their allegedly true, creepy camping experiences. If you have a story from a camping trip that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit that story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. Now, let's get into these creepy and allegedly true camping experiences that might just keep you from camping this summer. This was 1998 when this happened. An old friend of mine asked me to go camping with him. I hadn't been since I was about 12, so I agreed. It sounded fun, and I was excited all week leading up to the trip. I didn't get much sleep the night before because of it. He picked me up just after 5 a.m., and we drove the 100 miles to the park. I managed to get a bit of sleep on the ride, so I felt a little better when we arrived. Then, he dropped the bomb on me. We still had to walk another 2 hours to the campsite. I tried to talk him into choosing a closer one, but he swore I'd love the one we had when we made it. With a heavy heart, I followed him. The first half hour wasn't that bad, I guess. Most of it was downhill. However, as more time passed, I became sluggish. Halfway there, we took a short break, but were back on the trail before I knew it. The second leg was a lot more uphill. It wasn't long until I was dragging again, and not paying attention to where I was stepping. We arrived at a flat section, and I was relieved. My friend was in front, and somehow missed the trap, but I didn't. All I remember was that 1 second, I was clomping along and hitting the ground. The contact with the bottom of the hole jolted me awake, and the rush of adrenaline masked most of the pain. As I stood up, my right ankle buckled, and I dropped down onto a sharp stick jutting out below me. Apparently, there are several more stakes in the bottom of the hole, but they had been knocked over, thankfully. When I looked down, I saw the bone sticking out of my shin. Instinctively, I pulled the stick from my leg, and the pain made me even queasier than I already was. I looked up to get an idea of where I was, and only saw blue sky edged by trees. I figured the hole was only about 10 feet deep or more. It must have taken the idiots that dug it several days. I yelled up for my friend only to see his laughing face greet me over the edge. He didn't know the extent of my injuries at that moment, but when I told him, the laughing stopped and panic replaced it. I asked him what happened, and he told me it looked like some redneck poachers had dug up some type of bear trap and I'd fallen into it. I assumed he could simply reach down and pull me out, but that didn't work. So next, he attempted to reach me where I was with the tree limb. This worked at first, but when I tried to stand up, the pain was far too severe. I couldn't put any weight on my right leg. It was obvious I wasn't getting out of this hole without outside help. It was still early in the day, so I wasn't too concerned. I could hear my friend pacing around above me freaking out, so I called up to him in a calm voice and told him to get help. The ranger station was a little way, probably about an hour. He could easily get help and make it back with plenty of time before dark. Once he took off, I was left alone with nothing but the pain to occupy my time. By this time, it was now coming in waves, and accompanying nausea wasn't making it any better. Initially, I thought I could make a splint, but the moment I tried to tighten it down, I almost fainted. Leaving it alone seemed to be the best decision. I put my head between my knees and waited for the sick, dizzy feeling to pass. Eventually it did, and I tried to focus on other things. Singing worked for a while. That is until I started hearing thunder and noticed the sky above me getting darker by the minute. Getting a little wet wasn't going to kill me, right? Perhaps I should have considered my circumstances before saying that. The rain was relatively light at first, but within minutes it was coming down in sheets. I was okay until I began to notice the hole filling with water. That's when my panic began to rise. My feet were already submerged by the time I realized I was in trouble. I clawed my way up the wall until I was standing, at least the best I was able to, and started praying for it to stop. As the minutes passed, more of my body disappeared. After an hour, the storm began letting up and I could relax just a bit. The water level was only about halfway up to my shins, and I knew now, if it continued at that rate, I would be long gone before help arrived. Unfortunately, it was just a lull in the storm. Soon enough, the rain was sheeting down again. I tried to remain positive about the whole thing. I tried to take my mind off the pain in my leg. I tried to be upbeat, thinking back on funny jokes and movies. The next hour was the longest of my life. When help finally arrived, the rain had almost completely stopped. At the time the ropes pulled me out, the water was just below my belt. Thinking about drowning to death in that little hole, out in the middle of nowhere, still gives me the willies. Once I was out of the hole, the ride to the hospital felt like it went very fast. After a surgery where I acquired some screws and a few plates, I was allowed to go home. The next 8 weeks on crutches would drag by, but I was happy to be alive, broken leg or not. We never got to make up for the lost trip, but I have taken my kids out camping a few times in the years since. While it's on my mind, I might give my friend a ring. We haven't seen each other in a few years, and a camping trip may be the best way to catch up. I'll make sure to keep my eyes open this time, though. This is the story of my first and last camping experience. I was 16 at the time, and my family, my mother, sister, and brother, had made plans to go out camping with our aunt, uncle, and 2 cousins over the weekend. This was my family's first real camping trip, while my cousins, aunt, and uncle had gone camping dozens of times. Our first afternoon and evening out camping actually went quite well. I surprisingly had quite a bit of fun. It was later that night, maybe around 10:30 or so, my cousins, my sister, and myself were settling into our tent. We were lying in our makeshift bed when we heard footsteps circling around our tent. Slightly alarmed by this, we sat up and noticed that whoever was outside circling the tent was holding what we assumed to be a stick and tracing the tent as they circled it. At one point, my sister sticks her hand out and feels a leg through the tent's fabric. We knew it wasn't our mother, as she has a trach, and her breathing is very deep and distinct. It wasn't our brother, because he was only 5 at the time, and we heard a grown adult's footsteps. The weight behind them really let us know that it wasn't a child. Our cousins informed us that it was probably their dad, who always liked to play pranks, especially at nighttime. We decided to look out the small window of the tent, or flap, or whatever you really want to call it, I don't know. It gave us a great view of the whole campsite. We looked towards the road that was right by our site, and on the road with my aunt and uncle walking back from the restrooms. My cousins, sister, and I started to connect the dots. Whoever was outside circling our tent wasn't a member of our family. It was a complete stranger, and all that separated us from that individual was a tiny layer of fabric. As our uncle and aunt approached our campsite, we called for them to come over to our tent and told them what happened. Everything stopped after we talked to our aunt and uncle. We assumed the individual ran away when our aunt and uncle approached our campsite. My cousins and sister were still understandably freaked out about what had just happened. I, on the other hand, was so tired that I wasn't able to process what happened and how scary it actually was. The rest of the trip went seemingly well, and I enjoyed the rest of it as much as I possibly could. The worst part of it all is that nobody believed us. In fact, our aunt and uncle and mother made fun of us and told us that we were just being paranoid, as my cousin, sister, and I love everything creepy from conspiracy theories to urban legends. It still bothers me all this time later because I never found out who that individual was or what their intentions were. I also think, what could have happened if our aunt and uncle didn't come when they did? It's not like we'd be able to defend ourselves, as we were just teenage girls. Ever since then, I've been turned off of camping, and I don't see myself going again in the future. This is a Floridian cryptid camping story. I don't know if I sent this in before, but just in case, I'm going to send it to you again. I have made sure to put in some effort to make sure that all of my friends that were with us verified the same details that I remember. Anyways, back when I was in high school, sometime in 2016, my boyfriend asked me if I wanted to go camping with two of our friends. Their names were Gretchen, Cindy, and Daniel. I don't really like camping, but I love spending time with these three, and we would be graduating soon and moving on with our lives. So, during a Friday afternoon, we grabbed our favorite snacks from a 7-Eleven and drove to Claremont, as they used to have some cool woods. We set up our little campsite about 10 minutes from Gretchen's car and started playing Uno on a picnic blanket. Once it got dark, Daniel and I went into our tent, while Gretchen and Cindy went into theirs. I fell asleep relatively quickly because I was just beat from the day. I had a relatively strange dream where I was this creature roaming through the woods. It was like if you were watching through the view of a drone camera. I was moving very quickly until I saw the embers of a fire and started moving towards it. I realized it was our campsite, and I woke up in a cold sweat. I couldn't move, but I woke up Daniel and asked what was wrong. But I put my finger on his mouth and whispered, "I think there's something out there." We sat there just for a few minutes in silence when our tent's zipper started to come undone. I didn't look at it, but I could hear its raspy breathing. All of a sudden, there was a loud police siren that made this creature run off into the night. We got out of our tent and saw Gretchen and Cindy doing the same. As soon as we were in Gretchen's car, I asked what that thing was. This is what Cindy told me when I asked her to re-describe what she saw. It was tall, hunched over, black figure with the body of a sleek and slender figure, with the legs of a horse or maybe even a deer. Topping its body were the head of a human with antlers. She quickly grabbed her phone and played a police siren app she used to scare us. Whatever that creature was, it couldn't have been friendly, and I'm thankful Cindy scared it off. If anybody has any idea what this could be out in the woods of Florida, please let me know in the comments down below. This is not my story. This happened to my history teacher. He told this story to us once. We live in Anchorage, Alaska. Alaska is known for lots of nature and outdoor adventures. Many people like going hiking, kayaking, hunting, etc. My history teacher, Mr. C, decided to go camping by himself and his dog out in Talkeetna, which is probably about 3 hours away from the city. This area is well known for hunting. Mr. C finds a nice spot, and he decided to camp close to his truck. During the day, he played with his dog and did what most campers do: relax. It started to get dark, and he decided to get to bed. He had one person in his tent, which was himself, and his dog slept with him. Mr. C did have a knife and a gun with him. Toward the middle of the night, his dog kept whining. He figured his dog needed to use the restroom and unzipped his tent. Mr. C said his dog immediately dashed out into the woods. He thought this was a bit weird. He left the tent unzipped so his dog could come back inside. Mr. C is still laying there awake and suddenly begins to hear what sounds like someone walking towards his tent. He's silent and waits. He grips his weapon and stares at the open entrance and sees this strange human-shaped creature. He said it walked like a gorilla, but it was skinny, bony, and seemed to have no texture to its body. Mr. C froze in fear. He mentioned it was so dark he couldn't even see what it looked like, only its shape. Mr. C said it crept toward the tent entrance and just sat there. It just watched him lay there for 2 hours. It was sitting at the entrance of his tent. Mr. C didn't want to move. He had nowhere to go since this thing was blocking his way. He stared at it for the duration that it watched him sleep. It didn't move. It didn't budge. It didn't even fidget around as an animal would. At this point, he's wondering where his dog is and realized this is probably why his dog left. After a while, he heard his dog running back and barking in the background, and the strange creature jumped so fast and so high, he didn't even catch him to see where it ran off to. His dog came back to the tent, and Mr. C got the hell out of there in the morning. He said he'd never go back, and I don't blame him. I'm not really sure who came up with the idea first, but by day's end, we'd planned the destination and date. Although I'd been camping many times before, I'm almost positive neither Chuck or Glenn ever had. They had come into the family late in life, and my real dad had already died by then. He had been the guy who loved camping. My stepfather, not so much. Don't get me wrong, he's a great man, but the outdoors had never been his deal. The list of supplies needed for the trip was compiled and followed to the letter, including the 4 cases of beer. Perhaps the most important of all goods. We loaded up and been ready to leave at dawn the next morning. As we headed out, we had no idea of what lay ahead of us and how it would affect our connection to one another, a connection we once believed to be unbreakable. The 3-hour drive was uneventful and quiet. I was pleased to see how dry the surroundings were. Fire starting, while not hard for me, was not my strong suit, and I knew neither of my brothers had ever burned more than a cigarette. I brought along some lighter fluid just to be safe, although I never ended up needing it. While I worked on the fire, Chuck and Glenn set up the tent using knowledge they had learned watching YouTube videos. I had purposely got the easiest tent that I could find, yet it still took the better part of an hour before they had it up. The fire was already roaring by the time they joined me. I had buried the potatoes in the coals, prepared the steaks to be cooked, and was well into my second beer by then. The steaks didn't take long, and by dark, we were sitting down to a delicious meal. After dinner, the real camping began. I had chosen to camp out in the middle of nowhere on purpose. I knew we'd be more obnoxious and loud when we got drunk. More importantly, I liked to make big bonfires and turn my music up loud. You can't do that with others around you. That evening turned out to be a blast. We blew through 2 cases and didn't pass out until dawn. It was something I needed to do for a long time. Despite the hangover, I resolved then and there, it was something we were going to do much more often. While I finally drugged myself from my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Chuck and Glenn were already awake, sitting next to a cold fire. They both had a beer in their hand, and looked happy to see me. I asked them what was up with the fire, and Chuck mumbled something about not being able to get it relit. That made me chuckle. I walked over to the tree line and grabbed a handful of wood. When I returned, I sat down with the dead coals and blew onto them. The coals lit up brightly and the fire was roaring again within a few minutes. Then I went to the creek to fetch some water. The look on their face was priceless. Chuck's jaw was hanging open and I could tell Glenn was aching to ask me how I did it. While I waited for the water to boil, I cooked up a large mess of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with a cup of coffee. Once I had eaten, I was feeling much better and suggested we go fishing. We didn't make it back to the camp until almost dark. Unfortunately, no one had caught anything. Nothing we could keep anyway, but I could tell Chuck had already caught a good buzz. I cooked what was left of the steak, and after we set to finishing what was left of the beer. This evening was much tamer than the one before. I didn't want to make a big fire, it would only be harder for me to put it out completely before we left for home. Most of the night, the 3 of us talked about unimportant things like girls and work. Around 2 in the morning though, we decided to turn in, the beer long being drunk. My last memory was Chuck going to take a leak. He had drunk a lot more than Glenn or I. He fell several times trying to get out of his sleeping bag, but eventually made it out of the tent. I must have passed out just after that. The next thing I remember, the sun was already beginning to shine through the trees. I had to pee like crazy, so I fumbled my way to the zipper, trying not to wake the other 2 guys up. As I unzipped the tent, a weird burning smell similar to burned meat hit me. I figured one of the guys had already been up making breakfast. I looked behind me and Glenn was still asleep. Chuck must have been the one cooking, and he was terrible at it. I crawled out with a smirk on my face and a smart remark to him. I looked up, expecting to see my brother burning food, but what I was met with was a sight for serious horror. I never imagined I would see something like this. The fire was burned out and Chuck was nowhere to be seen. The dawn was still too dim to make out the large object laying across the dead coals. I walked up within a few steps and was hit fully by the burning smell. Then, all of a sudden, it hit me, what I was seeing. Chuck was laying face down across one corner of the cold fire, and he wasn't moving. Without a second thought, I grabbed his body and rolled it over. All I could see was black and smell the terrible burning. I began yelling for Glenn, and when he didn't answer immediately, I ran to the tent and shook him. He was reluctant at first, but when I yelled, "Chuck's f***ing dead!" loudly in his face, he jolted upright and asked me to repeat it. All I could do was point towards the remnants of the fire and the horrible vision that the sun was making clearer by the minute. He flew from the tent in one quick motion and came almost face to face with the charred body of our dead brother. I stood behind him, and silently, with my eyes closed, Glenn fell to his knees and started wailing. At that second, I wanted to be anywhere but there. The sound of Glenn's haunting wails and the horrid smell permeating the air was worse than any nightmare I have ever imagined. A cold breeze was blowing across me, and that was when it became clear that I peed myself. It didn't matter though. With every second the sight became clearer, and I was terrified to open my eyes. This was not the way I wanted to remember Chuck. I eventually crawled back into the tent and started crying myself. This continued for God knows how long, until I figured I should call 911 and let them know what happened. They arrived about half an hour later. When the coroner left with his body, I summoned the courage to come out. Glenn was speaking to some of the officers. The smell was still so bad. I began retching and retreated back into the tent. Soon after, another officer joined me inside the tent, and we talked about the trip and events of the night before. Nothing in particular. He left about 20 minutes later with the remaining officers. I began breaking down camp, and Glenn soon joined me. As we worked, nothing was said between us. I moved as fast as possible, hoping to soon be away from this awful place. Looking back now, I acknowledge I probably was a bit cold and uncaring. In my defense, I was the oldest and had the responsibility of notifying the rest of my family. I knew our mother was going to be crushed, and I wanted to tell her before she heard it from the news. When it comes to Glenn, I can't speak for how he was feeling or what he was thinking. No one has the right to dictate the other's feelings, you know? How to handle their grief, especially in a circumstance such as this. Telling Mom was really bad. She always wanted a large family. When Dad died, she thought her dream was over. However, when she met my stepfather and he mentioned adoption, she was overjoyed. Chuck and Glenn were actual brothers, about 2 years apart, and in their early teens, when Mom found them, boys their age were usually hard to adopt out. But Mom had fallen in love with them. I always considered them my blood, as did the rest of my family. Glenn and I stayed close to her for some time, knowing how hard Chuck's loss was. This was the first instance of where I began feeling Glenn harbored suspicions toward me. Nothing was said, but I caught him watching me with his unusual questioning look. Many times throughout that month, as the months passed more and more, questions began to be raised, many more than I care to mention. I had always assumed Chuck had passed out or tripped or fell into the fire, killing him. He had been much drunker than us. However, when the results came back from the medical examiner, certain things were off. The bruises, for instance, Chuck's back was covered in them. The thing was, Chuck played rugby with some guys from school and had for many years. Also, his skull was fractured, a worrying sign for sure. But even the doctor was forced to admit things like this happen in fire. The skull bursts or cracks from the heat. Horrible facts to hear, I agree, but for some reason they have cemented the suspicions in Glenn's mind. No matter how hard I try to show him this was the wrong time to be a part of some sort of conspiracy theory, he convinced himself I had something to do with our brother's death. I've had my own reservations toward Glenn and his relationship with Chuck. More than once. I saw them argue about something, but they stopped whenever I entered the room. Do I have my own suspicions? Yes. But now is not the time to fracture the family. Our mother needs us more than ever, right now. If she became aware of the distrust between us, it would not only break my heart, but it may just kill her. For the unforeseeable future, I'm going to do my best to bring us back together. If not for my mom's sake, perhaps Chuck's. On my own, I'm going to keep digging into the rift between the two brothers, and if it led to Chuck's death, even if it yields some terrible truth that I may not want to be aware of, I owe it to him. After all, Chuck was my brother too. Well, it's once again the end of the video, where I tell you guys about everything going on with the channel. Thank you guys as always for listening to these stories. And if you liked these camping stories, please hit that like button, as it helps me out a ton. The more likes this video gets, the more YouTube promotes it to fresh new eyes. Which one was your favorite tonight? I'd honestly have to say the last story was mine. I kind of saw where it was going halfway through. But even then, I don't think I was prepared for that sadness. What did you guys think about that story? I want to send a thank you to everybody who sends in their stories to the show as always. It's very much appreciated. And if you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, whether it's a camping story or something else, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that helps keep this channel going. If you're not aware, you can download your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories and bring them with you wherever you go. You can do that on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and pretty much everywhere else you find podcasts online. If you're not aware, I also make music. Me and my good friend, who's also a narrator, unit number 522, have started a metal band not that long ago. We put out 2 songs recently and we would love to hear your feedback on that. If you want to listen to the music, you can find a link to do so in the top of the description. Thank you guys as always. It's crazy to see how close we are to 175,000 swamp-dwelling creatures. I never thought we'd get this far. It's insane. Let's make our way to 200,000. Anyways, see you guys soon with another creepy video.